What if the gods didn't leave because their work was done, but because something made them go? What if the Anunnaki, those enigmatic beings woven through Sumerian tablets like threads of gold and shadow, vanished not by choice but by necessity? In the earliest written records of human civilization, pressed into wet clay by hands that trembled with both reverence and fear, there are stories of divine beings who descended from the heavens, who taught humanity the secrets of agriculture, astronomy, and writing itself. But then, without warning or explanation, they disappeared. The temples fell silent, the rituals continued, but the gods no longer answered. And in the gaps between cuneiform characters, in the silences carved into ancient stone, there may be hints of something else, something that came after, something more powerful than the gods themselves. So, before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that blur the line between divine myth and cosmic mystery. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient question stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. Tonight, we journey into the oldest written civilization on Earth, where the boundary between gods and beings from the sky was never quite clear, where myths may encode memories too strange to forget, and where the sudden silence of the divine might tell a story far more unsettling than their presence ever did. In the beginning, there were names, not prayers or temples or elaborate rituals, but simple names pressed into accounting tablets alongside inventories of grain and livestock. The Anunnaki appear in Sumerian texts not with fanfare or cosmic proclamations, but almost casually, as if they were simply understood to exist. Around 3000 BCE, in the ancient city of Uruk, scribes learning to write included the names of these beings in their earliest exercises, right alongside the words for bread and beer and barley. This wasn't mythology being created. This was record-keeping that assumed the Anunnaki were as real as the harvest, which raises an unsettling question. What if they were? The tablets from Uruk's earliest layers are small, roughly the size of your palm, pressed from river clay that still carries the faint smell of the Euphrates when moisture touches them in museum archives. The cuneiform marks are crude compared to later scripts, wedge-shaped impressions made with cut reeds, each character a record of pressure of a scribe's hand pushing symbols into soft mud before the sun could bake it hard. And there, among the mundane tallies of temple economics, among lists of sheep and measures of barley beer, the Anunnaki are named An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, not as distant theological concepts, but as recipients of offerings, as owners of property, as beings whose existence was simply assumed in the administrative machinery of the world's first cities. This is what makes the earliest references so compelling. There's no origin story attached to these names, no explanation of who the Anunnaki are or why they matter. They're just there, woven into the fabric of record-keeping, as if every scribe learning their profession understood that certain portions of the harvest went to the temple, and certain portions of what the temple held belonged to beings whose names had to be recorded with precision, the same precision used for counting cattle and measuring grain. This wasn't worship as we understand it. This was accounting that treated the divine as a category, requiring documentation, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, these earliest tablets show no evolution in understanding. There's no progression from primitive to sophisticated theology. The Anunnaki appear fully formed in the written record, with established names and relationships and hierarchies, as if the scribes were documenting something that had already been understood for generations before anyone thought to write it down. As if the knowledge was older than writing itself, preserved in oral tradition until clay and stylus finally gave it permanent form. But permanent form that still reads like witnessing, like record-keeping, like the documentation of something observed rather than something imagined. But it was the king lists. Those strange chronological documents that stretch back into impossibly deep time, that tell us something profound changed in human history. Sumerian king lists speak of a moment when kingship descended from heaven. Before that moment, according to the texts, there was no organized civilization, no cities, no written law. Then something arrived, and everything changed. The cuneiform is precise about this. Kingship came down. It didn't evolve or develop gradually. It descended, fully formed, bringing with it knowledge that transformed scattered settlements into the world's first urban civilization almost overnight. Archaeological evidence supports this sudden acceleration. Cities appeared. Writing emerged. Complex irrigation systems were built with mathematical precision, as if someone had flipped a switch, transforming humanity from simple farmers into architects of civilization. The Sumerian King List, first translated in full by Thorkild Jacobsen in 1939, opens with a phrase that has troubled scholars ever since. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not established, not founded, descended. The verb is specific, implying movement from above to below, from sky to earth, from somewhere else to here. And what follows is even stranger, a list of kings who reigned for impossibly long periods. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alaljar, reigned for 36,000 years. They're recorded with the same administrative precision used for everything else in Sumerian record-keeping, as if the scribes compiling this list believed they were documenting actual chronology, not mythological time. Modern scholars have attempted various explanations. Perhaps the numbers represent dynasties rather than individuals. Perhaps they're calculating in different units than solar years. Perhaps the entire pre-flood section of the king list is pure myth, a creation story designed to give Sumerian civilization a suitably impressive pedigree. But none of these explanations account for the abruptness of the change recorded in the text. The list doesn't describe a gradual lengthening of reigns as we move backward in time. It describes a sharp boundary. Before the flood, impossibly long reigns. After the flood, lifespans that rapidly approach normal human duration within a few generations. Something fundamental changed, and the Sumerians remembered it precisely enough to embed that change in their official chronologies. Archaeological excavations throughout southern Iraq have revealed something that lends uncomfortable support to this narrative of sudden acceleration. Around 3500 BCE, within a span of just a few centuries, southern Mesopotamia transformed. Scattered agricultural settlements gave way to true cities, with populations in the tens of thousands. Monumental architecture appeared, built with sophisticated understanding of engineering and astronomy. Writing emerged, not as simple pictographs, but as a fully functional system capable of recording complex transactions and abstract ideas. Irrigation networks were constructed that required centralized planning, mathematical calculation, and coordinated labor on a scale that shouldn't have been possible for such recently settled peoples. This wasn't the slow accumulation of knowledge over millennia. This was an explosion of capability that occurred within a time frame too brief for gradual cultural evolution. It's as if someone provided a blueprint, a complete package of civilization-building knowledge that transformed human society in the space of a few generations. And the Sumerians themselves attributed this transformation to the Anunnaki, to beings who descended from heaven bringing kingship, law, and the arts of civilization fully formed. They weren't describing gods in the abstract sense. They were describing teachers, organizers, beings who showed humanity how to build, how to irrigate, how to write, how to structure society. And then, after establishing these foundations, gradually withdrew, leaving humanity to continue the project alone. At Eridu, the oldest city in Sumer and perhaps the world, archaeologists uncovered something that shouldn't exist in such an early settlement. Beneath 17 successive temple layers, each built directly atop the ruins of the last, they found the original shrine, a small mud brick structure dating to around 5000 BCE, already oriented with astronomical precision, already built according to principles that would define Mesopotamian temple architecture for the next 3,000 years. This wasn't a primitive attempt at religious architecture that slowly improved over generations. The first temple contained the blueprint for all the others, and it was dedicated to Enki, the Anunnaki god of wisdom and water, who Sumerian texts say came from the Abzu, the cosmic deep, to teach humanity the arts of civilization. The excavations at Eridu, conducted initially by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd in the 1940s, and later continued by Iraqi archaeologists through the 1980s, revealed something that defies the standard narrative of architectural evolution. The deepest temple, the first one built on virgin sand at the edge of the ancient marshlands, already demonstrates sophisticated understanding of sacred geometry. Its walls are oriented to the cardinal directions, with precision that requires astronomical knowledge and careful surveying. Its floor plan follows proportions that would be repeated in Mesopotamian temple architecture for the next 3 millennia. And its foundation, laid on sand that preserves the footprints of the workers who built it, shows no signs of experimentation, no evidence of trial and error. It's as if the architects already knew exactly what they were building, following a template that existed before the first brick was laid. Layer by layer, as Eridu grew and its population expanded, new temples were built directly atop the old ones, each following the same basic plan, each oriented the same way, each maintaining the sacred proportions established in that first, impossibly sophisticated structure. 17 temples in succession, each rising from the ruins of its predecessor like a phoenix reborn from ashes, maintaining continuity across millennia of human habitation, and every single one dedicated to Enki, the god whose name appears in the earliest tablets, whose myths describe him bringing knowledge from the Abzu, teaching humanity agriculture and mathematics and writing, and the proper observation of celestial movements. The site plan of ancient Eridu reveals something else that shouldn't be there so early. The temple complex wasn't isolated. It was surrounded by residential districts laid out in organized patterns, by workshops where specialized crafts were practiced, by administrative buildings where the economic life of the city was coordinated. This level of urban planning, this degree of specialized labor and centralized organization, appears at Eridu almost from the beginning. There's no archaeological evidence of gradual development from simple village to complex city. The earliest layers that have been excavated already show urban characteristics that most societies take centuries to develop, as if the people who founded Eridu already understood how cities worked, already possessed the organizational knowledge necessary to manage large populations and coordinate complex activities. As if they had been taught, and there's something else buried at Eridu, something the excavators found that rarely gets mentioned in the published reports. Beneath the earliest temple, in layers that predate even that first sophisticated structure, they found evidence of an earlier settlement. Not urban, not organized. Just simple reed huts scattered along the marsh edge, occupied by people who hunted and fished and gathered wild plants. And then, with no transitional phase, the temple appears, the city begins. Kingship, as the texts say, descended from heaven. And Eridu, the place where it all started, became sacred precisely because it remembered that moment of transformation, the moment when everything changed and humanity learned to build toward the sky. In 1929, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley excavated the royal cemetery at Ur and discovered something unexpected among the grave goods and golden artifacts. Clay tablets, thousands of them, not buried intentionally as funerary texts, but scattered throughout the layers of habitation, as if the entire city had been a living library. Many were administrative, recording grain distributions and temple offerings, but others contained myths, hymns, and genealogies of the Anunnaki that stretched back before the flood, before kingship, before memory itself. These weren't abstract theological exercises. They read like documentation, family trees of beings who came from the sky, who interbred with humans, who ruled as kings and taught as teachers, and then, at some unspecified point in the deep past, withdrew. Woolley's excavation at Ur remains one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The royal tombs contained treasures that stunned the world. Golden headdresses, lapis lazuli jewelry, elaborate harps decorated with bulls' heads in gold and shell. But it was the tablets, scattered through the residential areas and temple precincts, that contained the real treasure. Because these weren't just religious texts. They were genealogies, king lists, administrative records that treated the Anunnaki not as abstract divine forces, but as individuals with names, family relationships, and specific roles in the governance of heaven and earth. One tablet, translated by Samuel Noah Kramer in the 1950s, lists the parentage of various Sumerian kings, tracing their lineages back through human ancestors to Anunnaki progenitors. These weren't symbolic claims of divine favor. They were presented as literal family trees, documenting which kings had which gods in their ancestry, how many generations removed they were from direct divine parentage, and what privileges or responsibilities they inherited through their bloodlines. The precision is remarkable. No vague claims of being blessed by the gods or chosen by heaven. Specific names, specific relationships, specific percentages of divine ancestry, calculated and recorded as carefully as property inheritance or temple revenues. Another set of tablets preserves hymns addressed to individual Anunnaki, but these hymns contain biographical details that read more like historical record than theological poetry. They describe where each god came from, what they taught humanity, which cities they favored, and how they related to the other members of the divine council. Enki is consistently associated with fresh water, with wisdom, with the creation of humanity, and with the city of Eridu. Enlil is connected to the air, to storms, to authority, and to the city of Nippur. Inanna is linked to Venus, to warfare, to sacred sexuality, and to Uruk. These aren't random associations. They're consistent across hundreds of texts spanning more than 1,000 years, as if the Sumerians were maintaining accurate records of real individuals with real characteristics and real histories. And then there are the genealogies of the Anunnaki themselves, preserved in fragments across multiple tablets, that attempt to map out the relationships among the divine council. Who was born from whom, who married whom, who held what position in the hierarchy. These read exactly like royal genealogies, with all the complexity and occasional contradiction you'd expect from documents trying to track multiple generations of a large extended family. Some tablets claim Enki and Enlil were brothers, sons of An. Others suggest a more complex relationship. Some texts give Inanna different parents in different contexts, but through all the variations, a consistent core structure emerges. An elder generation headed by An, a middle generation including Enlil and Enki, who were most involved in human affairs, and a younger generation, including Inanna and Utu and Nana, who served as intermediaries between the greater gods and humanity. This wasn't mythology developed through storytelling tradition. This was an attempt at historical documentation made by people who believed they were recording the structure of a real hierarchy, the genealogy of actual beings, the administration of a government that ruled not just Earth but heaven as well. And the fact that this record-keeping impulse extended even to the divine realm tells us something profound about how the Sumerians understood the Anunnaki. They weren't treating them as incomprehensible cosmic forces. They were treating them as powerful individuals whose actions and relationships could be documented, remembered, and passed down through written record, just like the reigns of human kings and the transactions of human temples. But it was the cosmology that revealed just how organized and hierarchical the Anunnaki truly were. Sumerian cosmology describes the Anunnaki as a council, not a single deity, 7 judges who decreed fate, 50 great gods who determined the laws of heaven and earth. This wasn't a simple pantheon where each god ruled a domain. This was a hierarchy, a power structure, with younger gods serving elder ones, with tasks distributed according to rank and function. The tablets describe disputes among them, negotiations, even labor strikes when the lesser Anunnaki grew tired of maintaining the world and decided to create humanity to do the work instead. These stories don't read like mythology. They read like organizational history, the records of a civilization that witnessed something it could only interpret through the lens of divinity, because no other framework existed to explain beings with such power. The number 7 appears repeatedly in Sumerian texts when describing the Anunnaki Council. 7 great gods who judge, 7 tablets of destiny, 7 gates to the underworld, each guarded by a different power. 7 is not a random choice. It's a number associated with completeness, with cosmic order, with the visible planets known to ancient astronomers. The 7 judges weren't arbitrary. They represented a specific organizational structure, a decision-making body that required quorum, that operated according to rules that could be appealed to and negotiated with by those lower in the hierarchy. And the hierarchy was complex. At the top, An, the Sky Father, distant and rarely involved in day-to-day affairs. Below him, the great Anunnaki, 50 gods who held significant power and responsibility. Among these 50, an inner circle of 7 who made the most important decisions. And below them, the Igigi, younger gods assigned to the actual labor of maintaining creation. This wasn't a family of gods in the Greek or Norse sense, where personalities and passions drove the stories. This was an administrative structure, a chain of command, a division of labor that sounds more like corporate or governmental hierarchy than traditional religious mythology. The texts describe the distribution of responsibilities with remarkable specificity. Enlil governed the atmosphere and had authority over the earth. Enki controlled the fresh waters beneath the earth and held knowledge of the sciences and arts. Ninhursag was responsible for birth and fertility. Utu governed the sun and justice. Nana ruled the moon and timekeeping. Each god had a specific portfolio, a defined sphere of influence, and the boundaries of these spheres were apparently important enough to cause conflicts when someone overstepped their authority. The most remarkable text in this regard is the Atrahasis epic, which describes a labor dispute among the gods that led to the creation of humanity. For generations, according to the text, the Igigi gods performed the hard work of digging canals, dredging rivers, and maintaining the irrigation systems that kept the world functioning. But after 40 years of this labor, they rebelled. They burned their tools, marched to Enlil's temple, and demanded relief. The great Anunnaki convened in council to discuss the crisis, and Enki proposed a solution. Create a new being, intelligent enough to follow instructions, but not powerful enough to challenge divine authority, who could take over the heavy labor while the gods rested. This new being would be made from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, giving it enough divine spark to be useful, but marking it as fundamentally different from the Anunnaki themselves. This is not the language of mythology. This is the language of labor relations, of administrative problem solving, of beings making pragmatic decisions about resource allocation and workforce management. And it's presented in the tablets not as allegory but as history, as the explanation for why humanity exists and what our fundamental purpose is within the cosmic order the Anunnaki established. We were created to serve, to bear the burden the younger gods no longer wanted to carry, to maintain the world while those with power attended to more important matters. And in exchange for this service, we received the gifts of civilization, agriculture, writing, law, mathematics, the knowledge necessary to organize ourselves and fulfill our purpose. But those gifts came with strings attached. We were meant to be workers, maintaining systems we didn't design, serving purposes we didn't choose, watched over by beings who considered themselves our creators, our teachers, and our rightful rulers. At the top of the hierarchy sat Anu, whose name simply means sky or heaven. He rarely descends to earth in the myths. He remains distant, almost abstract, ruling from his celestial city. But when he does appear in the tablets, it's always significant. He's the one who grants authority. He's the source of kingship. He's the father of Enlil and Enki, the two gods most involved in human affairs. Scholars have long noted how Anu seems more like a concept than a character in Sumerian literature. He's invoked but rarely active, present but remote, as if he represents something too vast or too far away to be directly involved in earthly matters, or as if, by the time these myths were being written down, he had already withdrawn to such a distance that he was more memory than presence. In the thousands of cuneiform tablets that survive from ancient Mesopotamia, Anu appears primarily in invocations, in the opening lines of prayers and hymns where his name is called first, establishing the cosmic hierarchy before addressing the gods who might actually respond. His temple in Uruk, the Eanna, was one of the most important religious structures in all of Sumer, yet the rituals performed there increasingly addressed his daughter Inanna rather than Anu himself. It's as if the Sumerians maintained the forms of worship but no longer expected the supreme god to participate directly in human affairs. When Anu does appear as an active character in the myths, it's usually to grant something: authority to Enlil to govern the earth, permission for Inanna to descend to the underworld, the tablet of destinies to whoever holds supreme power. He functions as a source, a legitimizing force, the ultimate authority from which all other power derives. But he doesn't intervene. He doesn't walk among humans. He doesn't teach or create or involve himself in the daily governance of the world he supposedly rules. His role is to be there, distant and supreme, while others do the actual work of managing creation. This remoteness has puzzled scholars for generations. In most ancient pantheons, the chief deity is also the most active, the one whose personality and preferences drive the major mythological narratives. Zeus, Odin, Ra, these gods are constantly involved in the stories told about them. But Anu is different. He's referenced constantly, but rarely present, honored universally but almost never directly encountered, as if he represents something that existed before, something that established the order of things and then stepped back, leaving the administration to others. Some researchers have suggested Anu represents the concept of divine authority itself, rather than a specific being. Others have proposed he's a memory of an even older religious tradition, a sky god whose worship predates the Sumerian civilization we can excavate and study. But there's another possibility, one that emerges when you read the texts not as theology, but as potential history. What if Anu represents a higher authority that existed above the Anunnaki who actually interacted with humanity? What if the gods we think of as supreme, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, were themselves subordinate to something else, something so far removed from earthly concerns that it appeared in human records only as a distant presence, a name invoked to legitimize the authority of beings closer and more immediately involved? The texts describe Anu's dwelling as being in the highest heaven, far above the realm where Enlil and Enki operate, impossibly distant from the earth where humanity struggles and builds and worships. And they're clear that this distance is not just spatial but hierarchical. Anu doesn't descend because his role is to remain above. to maintain the cosmic order from a position so elevated that direct involvement would be beneath him. Or perhaps, by the time the Sumerians were writing these stories down, Anu had already departed to such a degree that all that remained was the memory of his authority, invoked but no longer present, honored but no longer accessible, a god who had become more symbol than reality, more echo than voice. If Anu was distant, Enlil was immediate. His name means Lord Wind or Lord Storm, and in the myths, he's the one who actually governs the earth. His temple at Nippur was considered the religious center of all Sumer. Every king needed Enlil's blessing to rule legitimately. Every major decision required his approval, but Enlil was not always benevolent. The flood myth, preserved in multiple versions across Mesopotamian literature, makes it clear that Enlil decided to destroy humanity. The noise of human civilization disturbed him, the tablets say, and so he brought the waters. Only Enki's intervention, warning the righteous Yasudra to build a boat, prevented complete annihilation. This wasn't a loving father god. This was a powerful being who found humanity troublesome and nearly eliminated the species entirely. Enlil's temple at Nippur, the Akur, was unlike any other religious structure in ancient Mesopotamia. While other cities had patron deities and other temples held regional importance, Nippur was universally recognized as the spiritual center of Sumerian civilization. Kings from competing city-states who warred against each other relentlessly would still send offerings to Enlil's temple. Priests at Nippur served as mediators in political disputes. Their authority derived from Enlil's supreme position in the divine hierarchy. To control Nippur was to control the religious legitimacy of the entire region, which is why the city changed hands so often in military conflicts, but was never destroyed, never burned, never desecrated even by the most ruthless conquerors. Archaeological excavations at Nippur, conducted by American teams from the University of Pennsylvania, beginning in 1888 and continuing intermittently through the late 20th century, revealed layer upon layer of temple construction, each rebuilding more elaborate than the last, stretching back to the earliest periods of Sumerian civilization. The site yielded tens of thousands of tablets, many of them administrative records from the temple complex, documenting the massive economic engine that Enlil's worship required. Grain stores, livestock herds, workshops producing textiles and metalwork, and ceremonial objects, a bureaucracy employing hundreds of priests, scribes, craftsmen, and servants, all dedicated to maintaining the cult of a god who, according to the myths, barely tolerated humanity's existence. Because that's what makes Enlil so different from other supreme deities in ancient religions. He's not portrayed as a loving father or a wise teacher or even a just judge. He's portrayed as powerful and necessary but fundamentally ambivalent about humanity. The creation myths don't show him requesting the creation of humans or celebrating when Enki successfully fashions them from clay. He accepts humanity as a solution to the Agigi labor problem, but without enthusiasm, and when humans multiply and fill the earth and create the noise and chaos of civilization, his response is not to teach them better ways or guide them toward improvement. His response is annihilation. The flood narrative appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts: the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, the Gilgamesh flood story, and in every version, Enlil is the one who decides humanity must be destroyed. The reasons given vary slightly. In some versions, it's the noise of human cities disturbing the god's rest. In others, it's humanity's wickedness or failure to properly serve the divine order. But the consistent thread is Enlil's decision to wipe the slate clean, to bring waters that would drown every living thing and return the earth to primordial silence. What's remarkable is that this decision is presented not as righteous judgment but as irritation, as a powerful being eliminating a problem rather than a moral authority punishing evil. The texts describe the other Anunnaki as troubled by Enlil's decision, even fearful of it, but unable or unwilling to oppose him directly. Only Enki, whose relationship with humanity was different from the beginning, dares to intervene. And even he does so secretly, whispering warnings through reed walls, rather than openly defying the council's decree. And after the flood, when the waters recede and humanity survives through Enki's intervention, Enlil is furious at first, then gradually accepts that some humans have been preserved, eventually even blessing the flood survivor and granting him immortality. But there's no repentance, no acknowledgement that destroying humanity might have been an overreaction, just acceptance that the attempt at total annihilation failed and life must continue. This portrayal of divine power as capricious and dangerous, as something to be appeased rather than trusted, runs through all the Enlil myths. He's respected and feared but not loved. His authority is absolute but not comforting. And the fact that this is the god at the center of Sumerian religion, the one whose temple anchored the entire civilization's spiritual life, suggests something profound about how the Sumerians understood power. They weren't worshipping because they felt beloved or protected. They were worshipping because they understood they lived at the mercy of forces far beyond their control, forces that could choose to preserve them or destroy them based on calculations humans could never fully understand. Enki stands in stark contrast to Enlil. Where Enlil brought destruction, Enki brought preservation. Where Enlil was stern and distant, Enki was intimate with humanity, teaching them crafts and magic, creating them from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. Enki's symbol was the serpent, and he was associated with wisdom, water, and forbidden knowledge. In the flood narrative, he's the one who defies the council's decision to destroy humanity, whispering through the reed walls of Ziusudra's house to warn him of the coming catastrophe. Some scholars have noted the parallels between Enki and the serpent in Eden, both offering knowledge that other divine beings wanted kept from humanity, both paying a price for their intervention on humanity's behalf. Enki's temple at Eridu, the Abzu temple where the first shrine was built on virgin sand, was considered the source of all wisdom and magical knowledge in Sumerian tradition. The Abzu itself, the cosmic underground ocean of fresh water from which Enki drew his power, was believed to lie beneath Eridu's foundations, accessible through sacred wells and ritual spaces where priests could commune with the deep waters and the knowledge they contained. Archaeological excavations have confirmed the presence of a massive underground water table at Eridu, fed by the confluence of ancient watercourses, and the temple was indeed built directly over this aquifer, with channels and basins designed to bring the water up into sacred spaces where it could be seen and touched and used in rituals. But Enki's association with water went beyond the literal. In Sumerian thought, water was associated with wisdom, with the life-giving force that made civilization possible in the desert environment of southern Iraq. The same word, meant both water and semen, both wisdom and creative potential. Enki embodied all of these concepts. He was the god of fresh water that made agriculture possible, the god of semen that made reproduction possible. And most importantly, he was the god who chose to share all of this with humanity, even when other members of the Anunnaki Council believed humans should be kept ignorant and dependent. The myths describe Enki as clever, sometimes to the point of trickery. He's the one who solves problems, who finds creative solutions when brute force won't work. When the Agigi rebel and demand relief from their labor, it's Enki who proposes creating humanity as workers. When Enlil decides to destroy humanity with the flood, it's Enki who finds a way to save one family without directly violating the council's decree. When Inanna becomes trapped in the underworld, it's Enki who fashions magical beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails to rescue her. He operates through intelligence and lateral thinking, through understanding systems deeply enough to manipulate them, through knowing what rules can be bent and which must be followed, and he teaches these same skills to humanity. The tablets credit Enki with giving humans not just the basics of agriculture and animal husbandry, but the deeper arts. Mathematics, astronomy, writing, medicine, magic, the interpretation of dreams and omens. He's described as walking among humans in the early days, teaching them directly, answering questions, showing them how to observe the natural world and extract its secrets. His priesthood at Eridu maintained schools where scribes learned not just to write but to understand the deeper patterns encoded in cuneiform, where physicians studied anatomy and herbalism, where astronomers tracked the movements of planets with precision that still impresses modern researchers. This intimacy with humanity made Enki suspect in the eyes of other Anunnaki. The flood narrative makes it clear that his decision to warn Ziusudra was seen as a betrayal of the divine council's authority. Some texts hint at punishments or restrictions placed on Enki after his intervention, though the details are fragmentary. But he never seems to regret his choice. In every story, he remains humanity's advocate, the god who believes humans deserve knowledge and protection even when other divine beings see them as nothing more than convenient workers or annoying noisemakers. The parallel with the Eden serpent is impossible to ignore. Both Enki and the serpent offer knowledge that makes humans more like the divine. Both are associated with wisdom and with water or life force. Both act against the wishes of higher authorities who want to keep humanity ignorant, and both are portrayed ambiguously as benefactors from humanity's perspective but as troublemakers from the perspective of the established divine order. The fact that these patterns appear in both Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions, separated by centuries and cultural contexts, suggests they might both be preserving different versions of the same ancient memory, a memory of a divine being who took humanity's side, who gave us knowledge we weren't supposed to have, and who paid some price for that choice. Beneath the great Anunnaki, there were lesser divine beings called the Agigi, and their story is perhaps the strangest in the entire Sumerian corpus. According to the Atrahasis epic, the Agigi were younger gods assigned to maintain the world, to dig canals and tend the gardens and perform the endless labor required to keep creation functioning. But after generations of this work, they rebelled. They burned their tools, surrounded Enlil's temple, and demanded relief from their burden. The solution, proposed by Enki, was to create a new being who could take over the labor, a creature made from clay and divine blood who could work the earth while the gods rested. They called this new being Lulu, meaning primitive worker, humanity. But here's what's unsettling. If the tablets are recording actual events through a mythological lens, who were the Agigi? What were they doing? And what happened to them after humanity was created? The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1700 BCE, but preserving much older traditions, describes the Agigi's situation with remarkable sympathy. For 40 years, the text says, they performed the hard labor the great Anunnaki assigned them. They dug the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, established their courses, dredged them to proper depth. They excavated irrigation canals, built levees, created the entire water management system that would make Mesopotamian civilization possible. The work was backbreaking, endless, and unrewarding. The great Anunnaki, meanwhile, enjoyed the fruits of the Agigi's labor without participating in the actual work. The description of the rebellion is vivid. The Agigi gathered in secret, discussing their grievances, building solidarity. Then one night, they burned their tools, their spades and baskets, in a massive fire that lit the sky. They marched to Enlil's temple at Nippur and surrounded it, demanding he come out and address their concerns. The text describes Enlil as frightened, barricading himself inside while sending messengers to the other great Anunnaki for help. This is not the behavior of abstract divine forces. This is the behavior of a labor dispute, with workers organizing to confront management, with authority figures scrambling to respond to a crisis they didn't anticipate. The solution they arrived at, creating humanity to replace the Agigi as workers, raises profound questions about what these myths are really describing. If we read them as pure fantasy, they're interesting but not particularly troubling. But if we consider the possibility that they're encoding actual events through the only interpretive framework available to ancient peoples, the implications become darker. Who were the Agigi? Were they a subordinate group within whatever civilization or hierarchy the Anunnaki represented? Were they an entirely different category of being, and what happened to them after humanity was created to take over their work? The texts are unclear on this point, and the uncertainty itself is revealing. After the creation of humanity, the Agigi largely disappear from Sumerian literature. They're occasionally mentioned in later texts, but without the detail and narrative presence they had in the earlier creation stories. It's as if they fulfilled their role in the mythology by creating the crisis that led to humanity's creation, and then they were no longer needed in the stories, or as if whatever they represented in actual history had already passed from the scene by the time these myths were being written down. Some scholars have suggested the Agigi represent the transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural societies, with the rebellion symbolizing the social upheaval that occurred when humans settled into permanent communities and took up the hard work of farming. Others have proposed they represent conquered peoples forced into labor by early Sumerian city-states. But these explanations don't quite fit the texts, which clearly distinguish between the Igigi as divine beings and humanity as a newly created species. The Igigi existed before humans. They were capable of sophisticated organization and rebellion, and they were numerous enough and powerful enough to frighten even Enlil, the god who would later decide to destroy all humanity without apparent fear of resistance. What happened to them remains one of the great mysteries embedded in these ancient texts. Did they ascend to some other role after humanity took over their labor? Did they leave the earth entirely? Did they merge with humanity somehow, their divine blood becoming the genetic legacy that produced the heroes and kings of later ages? They simply record that the Agigi rebelled, that humanity was created to replace them, and that the problem was solved. But solved how, and at what cost to the Agigi themselves, remains locked in the silence between the cuneiform marks. The creation of humanity, as recorded in multiple Sumerian and Akkadian texts, was not an act of love or divine generosity. It was a practical solution to a labor problem. The gods needed workers. They mixed clay with the blood of a slain god, perhaps to give humans enough intelligence to follow instructions, but not enough to challenge divine authority. They created 7 males and 7 females, and from these all humanity descended. The tablets are explicit about humanity's purpose: to bear the yoke the gods no longer wanted to carry, to tend the gardens, maintain the temples, provide offerings. In exchange, humanity received the gifts of civilization, agriculture, writing, law, mathematics, astronomy, but these gifts came with a price. We were never meant to be equals. We were meant to serve. The Atrahasis epic describes the creation process in detail that reads more like a technical manual than a theological text. Enki, who conceived the plan, called for a specific god to be slain Wee-Ilu, whose name means something like God with intelligence. From Wee-Ilu's blood, mixed with clay from the Abzu, Enki and the mother goddess Nintu fashioned the first humans. The text is explicit that the divine blood was necessary to give humans enough consciousness to understand and follow complex instructions, to learn skills, to develop language and culture. But the clay component kept them earthbound, mortal, fundamentally different from the divine beings who created them. 7 males and 7 females were created in this first generation. Why 7? The number appears throughout Mesopotamian cosmology as representing completeness, cosmic order, the visible planets, the fundamental organization of heaven and earth. These 14 primordial humans were the templates for all future generations. From them, through natural reproduction, humanity multiplied and filled the earth, eventually creating the noise and chaos that would so disturb Enlil and precipitate the flood. But before that catastrophe, there was a golden age of sorts, when the Anunnaki walked among humans, teaching them the arts of civilization. The Sumerian king list describes early rulers with impossibly long lifespans, kings who reigned for thousands of years, and tablets from various cities describe these rulers as offspring of unions between Anunnaki and humans. The bloodlines were tracked carefully, as if the percentage of divine ancestry mattered, as if it conveyed specific abilities or authorities, or even physical characteristics that set certain individuals apart from common humanity. This careful attention to genealogy, this obsession with tracking who had divine blood, and how much and through which lineage, appears constantly in Sumerian texts. It wasn't metaphorical divine favor they were recording. It was literal genetic inheritance, percentage of Anunnaki ancestry calculated and documented as precisely as property ownership or grain stores. Kings and priests and the heads of important families all claimed descent from specific gods, and these claims were taken seriously enough to be recorded in official documents, verified by temple authorities, and used to establish political legitimacy. The gifts humanity received in exchange for their service were real and transformative. Agriculture allowed populations to grow beyond what hunting and gathering could support. Writing enabled the storage and transmission of complex information across time and space. Mathematics made possible the engineering feats that built the cities and irrigation systems. Astronomy allowed the tracking of seasons, the prediction of floods, the coordination of agricultural cycles. These weren't skills humans developed gradually through trial and error over millennia. They appeared suddenly in the archaeological record, fully formed, as if taught by someone who already possessed complete understanding. And the tablets are explicit that these gifts came from the Anunnaki, particularly from Enki, who brought the Mes, the fundamental principles of civilization, up from the Abzu and bestowed them on humanity. The Mes weren't abstract concepts. They were described as actual objects, physical manifestations of knowledge and power that could be stolen, transferred, or lost. Inanna famously got Enki drunk and tricked him into giving her a substantial portion of the Mes, which she then took to her city of Uruk, establishing its cultural and religious importance. If the Mes were simply abstract ideas, this story makes no sense. But if they were something concrete technologies, texts, tools, techniques, then the story reads like an account of knowledge transfer, of one city gaining advantages over another through acquiring specific capabilities. What emerges from these creation narratives is a picture of humanity fundamentally different from how we like to think of ourselves. We weren't the inevitable result of natural selection, gradually developing intelligence and culture through countless generations of adaptation. We were a designed solution to a specific problem, created with just enough capability to be useful but not enough to be threatening, given gifts of knowledge that elevated us far beyond our natural state but always within limits established by our creators. And our purpose, embedded in our very creation, was to serve, to maintain the systems the Anunnaki established, to provide offerings and labor and worship, to be the workers who would free the gods from physical toil while remaining forever subordinate to their authority. The question that haunts these texts is whether we've ever truly transcended that original purpose, whether the gifts we received came with conditions we still don't fully understand, whether the knowledge that transformed us from simple clay into civilization builders also bound us to obligations and limitations we've never recognized, let alone challenged. The tablets don't provide answers. They simply record what the Sumerians believed, that humanity was created to serve, that we owe our existence and all our capabilities to beings far more powerful than ourselves, and that those beings, for reasons never fully explained, eventually withdrew, leaving us to continue their work in their absence. In the earliest Sumerian period, according to the king lists and temple records, the gods didn't just receive worship from a distance. They walked among humans. They ruled as kings. The early monarchs of Uruk, Ur, and Lagash claimed direct descent from the Anunnaki, and temple texts describe these hybrid rulers with reverence and precision. Gilgamesh, the most famous king of Uruk, was said to be 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. His strength was legendary, his wisdom profound, his lifespan far exceeding normal human years. These weren't metaphors for exceptionally capable leaders. The texts describe them as literally different from ordinary humans. Taller, stronger, wiser, living far longer, as if some genetic legacy from the Anunnaki persisted in certain bloodlines long after the gods themselves had withdrawn. The Epic of Gilgamesh, pieced together from fragments found across Mesopotamia and painstakingly translated by George Smith in 1872, describes its protagonist in terms that go beyond poetic exaggeration. Gilgamesh was built by the gods themselves. The text says, "His body was perfected by divine craftsmen. He stood head and shoulders above ordinary men, could run for days without tiring, could hear conversations from miles away, could see into the distance with clarity that defied normal human vision. When he fought the wild man Enkidu, their wrestling match shook the foundations of Uruk, cracked walls, and sent tremors through the earth. These aren't the achievements of an exceptional but still human warrior. They're descriptions of someone fundamentally different, someone whose physical capabilities exceeded the normal human range by margins too vast to attribute to training or talent alone. And the text is explicit about why. Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, the product of a union between the goddess Ninsun and a human father, though some versions suggest his divine ancestry was even more direct. But Gilgamesh wasn't unique. The king lists and temple records from various Sumerian cities all describe early rulers as offspring of divine human unions. Lugalbanda, Gilgamesh's father, was himself said to be divine. Mezkiag Gasha of Uruk entered the sea and ascended to the mountains, a phrase scholars still debate, but which suggests he possessed abilities ordinary humans lacked. Dumuzi, the shepherd king who married the goddess Inanna, was human but became divine through that union, ascending to the heavens when he died only to be dragged down to the underworld as Inanna's substitute. These stories aren't outliers or exceptional cases. They represent the standard understanding of how kingship worked in the earliest periods. Rulers were hybrid beings, possessing enough divine blood to give them superhuman capabilities, while remaining mortal enough to govern human cities and eventually die. The percentage of divine ancestry mattered and was calculated with bureaucratic precision. 2/3 divine meant something specific, conveyed particular abilities, and placed the individual in a specific position within both human and divine hierarchies. Archaeological evidence can't directly confirm superhuman abilities, but it does reveal something interesting about the physical remains of elite individuals from early Sumerian periods. The royal tombs at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, contained skeletal remains that showed unusual features, greater height than the general population, bone density suggesting unusual strength, dietary analysis indicating access to foods and nutrients the common people never consumed. These could be explained by privileged nutrition and selective breeding among elite lineages. But the texts themselves suggest the explanation is more profound. These individuals were literally different because they carried genetic inheritance from beings who were not entirely human. The transition from divine human hybrids to fully human kings is documented in the king lists, with the same administrative precision Sumerians applied to everything else. Early rulers reigned for thousands of years, then hundreds. Then lifespans began approaching normal human duration. Gilgamesh himself, despite his 2/3 divine nature, was mortal. His great quest, The central narrative of his epic was to find immortality after witnessing his friend Enkidu's death and realizing that he too would eventually die despite his divine blood. He failed. Even hybrid beings were ultimately subject to death, though they lived far longer and possessed far greater capabilities than ordinary humans while they existed. This gradual diminishment of divine characteristics in the ruling bloodlines suggests something important about what was happening in the earliest periods of Sumerian civilization. The direct presence of the Anunnaki was withdrawing, and each generation of hybrid offspring contained less divine essence than the one before. It was as if the genetic legacy was being diluted through successive generations of interbreeding with humans, until eventually the ruling families, while still claiming divine descent and maintaining their political legitimacy through those ancient bloodlines, no longer possessed the superhuman characteristics that had set their ancestors apart. The gods had walked among humans, had produced hybrid offspring who ruled as kings, but that age was ending, and all that would remain was memory and the hope that such direct contact might one day return. Biblical scholars have long noted the parallels between Sumerian accounts of divine human hybrids and the Genesis narrative of the Nephilim. When the sons of God came to the daughters of men, Genesis says, they bore children to them. These were the heroes of old, warriors of renown. The Hebrew word Nephilim is often translated as giants, but its root suggests something closer to fallen ones, or those who came down. The Book of Enoch, removed from the biblical canon but preserved in Ethiopian Christianity, expands on this story dramatically, describing 200 angels who descended to Mount Hermon, took human wives, and taught humanity forbidden arts, metalworking, cosmetics, astronomy, and warfare. Their hybrid children became tyrants who consumed everything and threatened to destroy the world, precipitating the flood as a divine response. These parallel narratives, separated by centuries but remarkably consistent, suggest a common memory preserved in different cultural contexts. The Genesis account is brief but specific. Genesis chapter 6 describes a time when divine beings noticed human women were beautiful and took wives from among them. The offspring of these unions were the Nephilim, described as the mighty men of old, men of renown. Then the flood came, and the text moves on, leaving vast questions unanswered. Who were these sons of God? Why did their unions with human women produce notable offspring? What happened to the Nephilim? The canonical text doesn't elaborate, but the Book of Enoch fills in details that align remarkably well with Sumerian accounts. Enoch describes 200 watchers angels assigned to observe humanity who conspired together on Mount Hermon to descend and take human wives. Their leader, Semyaza, organized the pact, and each watcher swore an oath binding them all to the plan, so that no individual could be held solely responsible for the transgression. They descended, chose wives, and taught humanity knowledge that was explicitly forbidden. Azazel taught metallurgy and weapon-making. Semyaza taught enchantments and root-cutting. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakel taught astrology. Kokabiel taught the signs of the stars and constellations. The parallels to Enki's gifts to humanity are impossible to miss. In both traditions, divine or semi-divine beings give humans knowledge they weren't meant to have. Knowledge that elevates human capability but also corrupts or endangers them. And in both traditions, this knowledge transfer is seen as transgressive, as a violation of divine law that brings consequences. The offspring of the Watchers and human women were giants, the Book of Enoch says, who grew to enormous size and consumed everything. They ate all the food humans produced, then began eating the humans themselves, then turned on each other in cannibalistic violence. Their presence on Earth became unsustainable, and their violence so extreme that creation itself was threatened. This precipitated a divine response. The archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel were sent to bind the watchers in the valleys of the earth until the day of judgment, and the flood was sent to cleanse the world of the giants and the corruption they had caused. Again, the parallels to Mesopotamian flood narratives are striking. In both traditions, divine-human hybridization leads to a crisis that threatens the world. In both, the solution is a catastrophic flood that nearly destroys humanity. In both, a righteous man is warned and builds a boat to preserve life. The details differ, but the narrative structure is identical, as if both cultures preserved the same sequence of events, filtered through different theological frameworks. Scholars have long debated whether the Hebrew accounts borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian traditions or whether both preserve independent memories of common events. The consensus has shifted towards seeing clear influence from Mesopotamian sources, particularly after cuneiform tablets containing flood narratives were discovered and translated in the 19th century, predating the biblical texts by centuries or millennia. But the consistency of the core story across multiple cultures, Sumerian, Akkadian, Hebrew, and even echoes in Greek mythology with the Titans and their offspring, suggests something deeper than simple cultural borrowing. What if these are all attempts to record and make sense of actual events that occurred in deep prehistory? Events that different cultures interpreted through their own religious and mythological frameworks, but that shared a common core of truth? Beings who came down, whether called Anunnaki or Watchers or Sons of God, unions with humans that produced hybrid offspring with exceptional abilities, the teaching of advanced knowledge that transformed human civilization, a catastrophe, a flood that nearly destroyed everything, and afterward the withdrawal of direct divine presence, leaving humanity to continue alone with only fragments of the knowledge they had been given and memories of a time when the gods walked the earth. But then, at some point in the deep past, the Anunnaki stopped appearing. The king lists transitioned from rulers with impossibly long reigns measured in thousands of years to more plausible historical monarchs with ordinary lifespans. Temple texts shifted from recording direct divine interventions to describing prayers and offerings made in hope of divine favor. The gods were still worshipped, still invoked, still central to Sumerian religion and culture, but they no longer walked the earth. They no longer ruled as kings. They no longer appeared in forms that could be touched and seen and recorded in the detailed administrative fashion Sumerians applied to everything else. Something had changed. The direct presence withdrew, leaving only memory, ritual, and the hope that one day the gods might return. The transition is documented in the archaeological record with surprising clarity. Early layers show temple construction on a massive scale, suggesting civilizations mobilizing enormous resources for structures designed to house and honor divine beings who were expected to physically occupy those spaces. The temples weren't just symbolic, they contained living quarters, throne rooms, dining facilities, all the practical accommodations you'd provide for important visitors who would actually use them. But as you move up through the layers, through the centuries and millennia of continuous occupation at sites like Uruk and Ur and Nippur, the nature of temple construction changes. The structures become more elaborate but less practical, more focused on ritual and symbolism, less focused on actually housing divine residents. The inner sanctums, which early texts describe as the gods' bedrooms and private quarters, become increasingly stylized, decorated with imagery and inscriptions but less equipped for actual habitation. The texts change too. Early tablets record direct divine communications, oracles where the god speaks in first person through priests or appears in physical form to deliver messages. But later texts describe prayers sent upward with hope but without guarantee of response. Divination becomes more important, interpreting signs and omens because the gods no longer speak directly. Rituals become more elaborate, as if the Sumerians were trying harder and harder to attract divine attention that was increasingly difficult to capture. This wasn't a loss of faith. The Sumerians never stopped believing in the Anunnaki, never abandoned their temples or ceased their offerings, but the relationship had fundamentally changed from one of direct interaction to one of distant hope. The gods had withdrawn to the heavens, and while they were still believed to influence events from above, they no longer descended to walk among humans as they had in the earlier ages. Various theories attempt to explain this transition. Perhaps it's simply the natural evolution from animistic belief in physically present spirits to more abstract theological concepts of transcendent deities. Perhaps it reflects political changes, as priestly classes consolidated power by controlling access to gods who were increasingly understood as distant and unknowable. Perhaps it's the gradual transformation of actual historical memories into mythological narratives as generations passed and direct witnesses died. But there's another possibility, one that emerges when you read these texts not as theology but as attempted history. What if beings who had once walked among humans, who had ruled as kings and taught civilizations arts, departed at some point in the historical record, leaving behind a civilization that could maintain what they had been taught but could no longer learn new things directly from the source? What if the obsessive preservation of ancient knowledge in temple schools, the careful copying of tablets containing mathematical formulas and astronomical tables and medical treatments, represented humanity's attempt to preserve gifts we could no longer replace because the teachers were gone? The silence itself is telling. Civilizations don't forget their gods casually. The fact that the Sumerians remembered the Anunnaki in such detail, preserved their names and hierarchies and characteristics with bureaucratic precision, maintained their temples and rituals for thousands of years after the direct presence had ceased, suggests that the departure was significant enough to mark a clear before and after in collective cultural memory. Something happened. The age of divine human interaction ended, and humanity has been looking upward ever since, maintaining the rituals, preserving the knowledge, waiting for the return of teachers who walked the earth in ages past, but whose presence is now only memory and hope. What remained after the Anunnaki's departure was an obsession with the heavens that bordered on frantic. Sumerian astronomers tracked planetary movements with extraordinary precision, noting positions and calculating cycles with mathematical sophistication that wouldn't be matched for millennia. They identified planets by name Nibiru, Marduk, Ishtar, and tracked them across the night sky with an intensity that suggests they weren't just curious. They were watching for something, waiting for something. Babylonian astronomical tablets from the first millennium BCE record planetary positions with accuracy that modern astronomers have verified down to the degree. Why this precision? Why this obsessive tracking of celestial movements? Unless they were watching for the return of something that had come from the sky before. The astronomical tablets known as the Enuma Anu Enlil, a comprehensive series of omens based on celestial observations, represent one of the most sophisticated astronomical databases of the ancient world. Compiled over centuries, eventually encompassing 70 tablets containing 7,000 omens, this collection records not just what the Babylonian astronomers saw in the sky, but what they believed those observations meant. Each planetary position, each conjunction, each eclipse was associated with specific predictions about earthly events. Wars, floods, the rise and fall of kings, the health of nations, all were believed to be written in the movements of celestial bodies. But beneath the omen interpretations lies something more fundamental, incredibly precise observational astronomy. The tablets record planetary positions, lunar phases, eclipse cycles, and stellar movements with accuracy that shouldn't have been possible given their technology. They calculated the synodic period of Venus, the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position relative to the Sun, to within a fraction of a day of the modern value. They predicted lunar eclipses using sophisticated mathematical models. They tracked the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble in Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete one cycle, despite having no instruments capable of directly measuring such subtle changes. Modern historians of science have been forced to acknowledge that Babylonian astronomy was far more advanced than anyone expected, that these ancient observers understood celestial mechanics at a level of mathematical sophistication that we assumed didn't exist until Greek and Islamic astronomers developed it thousands of years later. The question is why? Why invest such enormous resources in tracking the sky with obsessive precision? Why maintain observation programs that span generations, with each astronomer training their successor to continue recording data in exactly the same format, using exactly the same methods? The tablets themselves suggest an answer. The gods came from the sky. The planets were not just celestial bodies, but were identified with specific deities. Marduk with Jupiter, Ishtar with Venus, Nergal with Mars. The movements of these planets were therefore the movements of the gods themselves, or at least indicators of divine activity and intention. To track the planets was to track the gods, to watch for their return, to look for signs that the age of divine-human interaction might resume. The planet Nibiru appears in Babylonian astronomical texts with particular significance. In some contexts, it seems to refer to Jupiter at the crossing point of its orbit. In others, it's associated with Marduk and described as a celestial body whose appearance marks momentous changes in the cosmic order. The exact astronomical referent has been debated by scholars, and some fringe researchers have proposed it represents a hypothetical planet with a long elliptical orbit that periodically returns to the inner solar system. What's clear is that Nibiru was important, was watched for, was associated with divine authority and cosmic transformation. The ziggurat temples built throughout Mesopotamia served multiple functions, but one that's often overlooked is their role as astronomical observatories. The flat platforms at their tops provided ideal viewing positions for scanning the horizon and tracking planetary movements. Priests trained in astronomical observation would spend nights on these platforms, recording what they saw, comparing it to previous observations preserved in the temple libraries, looking for patterns and cycles and anomalies that might signal important events. This astronomical work wasn't abstract science for its own sake. It was fundamentally religious, fundamentally about maintaining contact, or at least awareness of divine movements, even though the direct presence had withdrawn. If the gods had ascended to the heavens, then watching the heavens was the way to track the gods, to know where they were and what they were doing, and perhaps to detect early warning of their return. The precision wasn't excessive. It was necessary, because if something important was about to happen, if the Anunnaki were about to return, the astronomers needed to see it coming, needed to prepare, needed to ensure humanity was ready for the moment when the age of divine silence might end and direct contact might resume. Among the most mysterious objects in Sumerian mythology is the Tablet of Destinies, a divine artifact that granted its possessor supreme authority over heaven and earth. Multiple myths describe conflicts over this tablet, with various gods and creatures attempting to seize it from its rightful holder. The Anzu birds stole it from Enlil. Marduk claimed it after defeating Tiamat. But here's what's strange. The tablet isn't described as metaphorical power. It's described as an actual object, worn on the chest, that somehow conveyed authority and control over cosmic forces. Some researchers have speculated it might represent advanced technology described through the only vocabulary available to ancient scribes. A communication device, a weapon, a source of power that, in the hands of whoever possessed it, made them effectively supreme. And according to the myths, control of this tablet changed hands multiple times, as if there was an ongoing power struggle in the divine realm that humanity could only observe from below. The myth of Anzu and the Tablet of Destinies, preserved in multiple versions from different periods, tells a story that reads more like a political thriller than a creation myth. Enlil, who held the tablet and with its supreme authority over the earth, kept it in his private chambers. Anzu, described variably as a bird, a storm demon, or a divine being in bird form, served Enlil faithfully until he noticed the tablet and understood what it represented. While Enlil was bathing, Anzu seized the tablet and fled to the mountains. The theft of the tablet immediately threw the cosmos into chaos. The divine assembly couldn't function properly. The me, those fundamental laws and principles that govern civilization, ceased to operate correctly. Storms raged unchecked. Order broke down because the symbol of authority, the mechanism through which cosmic law was enforced, had been stolen. The gods met in emergency council and called for volunteers to retrieve the tablet from Anzu, but several gods refused, recognizing that whoever possessed the tablet held power greater than their own, even if they were its rightful owner. Eventually, Ninurta, a warrior god, accepted the task, but even he couldn't defeat Anzu in straightforward combat, because the tablet gave its possessor control over the very weapons being used against them. Ninurta's arrows would fall powerless from the sky. His attacks were neutralized before they could strike. Only through trickery and the intervention of Ea, who advised Ninurta on how to overcome the tablet's defenses, was Anzu finally defeated, and the tablet returned to Enlil. The description of the tablet itself is consistent across multiple texts. It was worn on the chest. It granted authority over cosmic forces. It made its possessor effectively invulnerable to normal attacks. It controlled the me, those fundamental principles of civilization. These aren't the characteristics of a symbolic object. These are the characteristics of technology, of a device that conferred specific capabilities to whoever wielded it. Modern researchers attempting to understand the Tablet of Destinies have proposed various interpretations. Some see it as a symbol of legitimate authority, like a crown or scepter, with its power deriving from social recognition rather than inherent capability. Others interpret it as representing knowledge itself, with whoever possessed comprehensive understanding of cosmic law being able to command the universe. But these interpretations struggle to explain why the tablets describe it as having specific physical properties, as being something that could be stolen, worn, used as a weapon, and whose possession immediately conveyed tangible power, regardless of whether others recognized that authority. What if the ancient scribes were describing an actual object using the only vocabulary available to them? A device whose function they didn't fully understand, but whose effects they could observe and record. In our modern context, we might describe it as a control system, a command authority interface, a communications device with override capabilities. But to someone in 3000 BCE, such concepts would be incomprehensible. They would describe what they saw, an object worn on the chest that granted its possessor control over forces ordinary beings couldn't command. And the fact that this object changed hands multiple times in the myths, that various gods and beings fought over it, that its possession was contested and unstable, suggests something important about the power dynamics among the Anunnaki themselves. Authority wasn't fixed. It could be seized, transferred, lost, and regained. There was conflict in the divine realm, genuine struggle for control, with the Tablet of Destinies as both the symbol and mechanism of supreme power. And the myths preserve memories of periods when that ruler changed, when cosmic authority was violently transferred from one entity to another, when the hierarchy humanity thought was eternal proved to be as subject to revolution and upheaval as any human government. The implications are profound. If the Tablet of Destinies represents actual technology rather than symbolic authority, then the Anunnaki's power wasn't inherent to their being but depended on possessing specific tools or knowledge. And if those tools could be stolen or seized, then the gods were vulnerable in ways that traditional theology doesn't acknowledge. They could lose power. They could be overthrown. They could disappear not because they chose to withdraw, but because something or someone stronger took control and removed them from the scene. The myths describe a dynamic, contested divine realm where authority changed hands through conflict, and humanity, watching from below, could only record what they observed and wonder what it meant for their own fate when the powers that ruled heaven and earth were themselves engaged in struggles for supremacy. Enki's domain was the Abzu, translated variously as abyss, deep, or cosmic waters beneath the earth. It was from the Abzu that Enki brought the Mez, the fundamental laws and principles that govern civilization. Knowledge of kingship, priesthood, writing, mathematics, metalworking, warfare, music, and every other craft and art. The Mez weren't learned through trial and error. They were brought up from the Abzu, fully formed, and given to humanity as gifts. The Sumerians described it as both a physical place beneath the earth and a cosmic realm beyond ordinary reality. Enki's temple at Eridu was built directly over the sweet water that rose from the underground aquifer, and rituals performed there were meant to connect with the Abzu's power. Some scholars have suggested the Abzu represents the collective unconscious, the source of all human knowledge. Others have wondered if it might describe something more literal, a place, perhaps beneath the earth or beneath the water, where knowledge was stored and accessed by those who knew how. The word Abzu itself is one of the oldest in the Sumerian language, appearing in the earliest tablets, already carrying connotations of depth, mystery, and primordial power. In the creation myths, the Abzu exists before the gods themselves, a cosmic ocean of fresh water from which everything emerged. But unlike the chaotic salt waters of Tiamat, which represented disorder and had to be defeated to create the world, the Abzu was ordered, structured, the source of wisdom and life-giving water. Enki's relationship with the Abzu is complex and shifts across different texts. In some versions, the Abzu is a place, Enki's dwelling beneath the earth, where he maintains the cosmic order and stores all knowledge. In others, Abzu is personified as a primordial deity whom Enki defeats or subdues to claim dominion over the deep waters. But consistently across all versions, the Abzu is where knowledge comes from, where the Mez reside, where the fundamental principles that make civilization possible are kept and accessed. The Mez themselves are described in texts with remarkable specificity. They weren't abstract concepts, but actual objects, or perhaps discrete packets of knowledge that could be counted, stolen, transferred from one deity to another. The myth of Inanna and Enki describes how Inanna got Enki drunk during a feast and convinced him to give her the Mez. The text then lists them one by one: kingship, godship, the priestly office, truth, descent into the underworld and ascent from it, the art of lovemaking, the destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing, music, eldership, heroism, power, enmity, straightforwardness, the sacking of cities, and dozens more. Each me is treated as a distinct thing that can be possessed, given away, or stolen. Inanna loads them into her boat and sails away to Uruk, while Enki, sobering up, realizes what he's done and sends demons to retrieve them. She fights them off and successfully brings the Mez to her city, establishing Uruk as a center of culture and power. This isn't the language of gradually developed cultural practices or evolved social institutions. This is the language of technology transfer, of knowledge being moved from one location to another in discrete, identifiable units. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have revealed the physical reality beneath the mythological descriptions. The temple complex was indeed built over a massive freshwater aquifer, fed by the confluence of ancient watercourses that created an underground reservoir of sweet water in the midst of the brackish marshlands. The earliest temples incorporated channels and pools that brought this water up into the sacred spaces, creating a direct connection between the ritual areas where priests performed ceremonies and the deep waters below. Later temples became more elaborate, with descending staircases and underground chambers that reached down toward the water table, as if trying to get closer to the source of wisdom itself. Some of these chambers were too deep and too elaborate to serve simple, practical purposes. They seemed designed for ritual descent, for physically traveling downward into the earth, in imitation of Enki's mythological journeys to the Abzu. What if the Abzu describes an actual repository of knowledge? Not metaphorical or psychological, but literal. A library, a database, a storage facility located beneath the earth or beneath the water, where information was kept in forms we can't quite imagine. The Sumerians themselves seemed to believe it was real, that wisdom didn't originate in human minds but was accessed from an external source, brought up from the depths by those who knew how to reach it. And Enki, the god who loved humanity enough to share what other gods wanted kept secret, was the one who brought that knowledge up and distributed it to human civilization. The priests at Eridu, trained in the mysteries of the Abzu, maintained this knowledge transfer for thousands of years. They taught scribes and astronomers and physicians, passing down wisdom that seemed to appear fully formed rather than developed gradually, and they described their knowledge as coming from below, from the deep, from the cosmic waters where Enki dwelled and where all secrets were stored, waiting for those with the courage and skill to descend and retrieve them. Sumerian mythology is filled with divine conflicts. Enlil versus Enki, Inanna's descent to the underworld, Ninurta's battles against chaos monsters. These weren't abstract theological allegories. They were described with the specificity of war reports, tactics, casualties, shifting alliances, territories lost and gained. The myths speak of weapons that could shatter mountains, of battles that devastated the earth, of conflicts between divine factions that humanity could only watch in terror from below. One text describes Ninurta using a weapon called the Sharur, a mace that could speak and fly and strike distant targets with devastating force. Another describes Inanna wielding the 7 Mess as weapons that could destroy cities. If these myths encode actual events witnessed by ancient peoples, what were they really seeing? What kind of conflict plays out with weapons that can level mountains and make stones speak? The myth of Ninurta and the Sharur, preserved in tablets from the early 2nd millennium BCE, describes a weapon unlike anything in the normal human arsenal. The Sharur could fly through the air independently, scouting enemy positions and reporting back to Ninurta. It could speak with a voice that terrified opponents. It could strike from a distance with force powerful enough to shatter stone fortifications. The text describes Ninurta sending the Sharur ahead of his army, using it to weaken enemy defenses before the main attack, treating it as both weapon and intelligence-gathering device. This isn't how ancient peoples normally described weapons. Swords and spears and bows were well understood, and myths involving human heroes used them in straightforward ways. But divine weapons operated differently, possessed capabilities that seemed impossible, yet were described with consistent detail across multiple texts, as if the scribes were trying to document something they had witnessed or heard described but couldn't fully understand. Inanna's weapons were equally mysterious. When she armed herself for battle, she didn't just take up sword and shield, she wielded the Mez themselves, those fundamental principles of civilization, as instruments of destruction. The texts describe her destroying cities not through siege and assault, but through some kind of power that made walls crumble and populations flee. After her campaigns, the defeated cities were described as empty, devastated in ways that sounded more like natural disasters than military conquest. The war between Enlil and Enki, while less directly violent, was described as a conflict of cosmic significance. Their disputes over humanity's fate, over whether humans should be preserved or destroyed, over who had authority to make such decisions, played out in council debates but also in direct opposition of their powers. When Enlil decided to bring the flood, Enki worked against him by warning Ziusudra, effectively sabotaging the attempted genocide. The aftermath with Enlil's fury at discovering some humans had survived, reads like a political crisis within a ruling council, with recriminations and power struggles, and eventually an uneasy peace that resolved nothing permanently. Other texts describe wars between gods and chaos monsters, with Ninurta fighting the Asag, a demon whose very presence made the earth barren, whose body was composed of stones, and whose power corrupted the natural order. The battle is described in terms that sound like environmental catastrophe, with landscapes being destroyed, waters turning foul, and the earth itself becoming sick from the conflict. Ninurta's victory required not just defeating the Asag, but healing the land afterward, building dams to restore proper water flow and performing rituals to cleanse the contamination. What were these myths describing? If we read them as pure fantasy, they're interesting but reveal nothing beyond human imagination. But if we consider that they might encode observations of actual events, the descriptions become troubling. Weapons that fly and speak and strike from distances. Conflicts that devastate landscapes in ways that sound more like modern warfare than ancient battles. Powers that corrupt the environment and require extensive remediation. Factions within the Divine Council whose disagreements play out through actions that affect all of humanity. Archaeological evidence across Mesopotamia reveals periods of sudden, catastrophic destruction at various sites. Cities burned, populations displaced, landscapes altered in ways that suggest violence far beyond what rival human armies could inflict on each other. Radiocarbon dating sometimes places these destruction events close together chronologically, as if a wave of devastation swept across the region within a short time frame. The myths describe wars of the gods. The archaeological record shows devastation, and the texts are clear that humanity was caught in the middle, suffering the consequences of conflicts between powers they couldn't resist or fully understand. Perhaps the most psychologically complex myth in the Sumerian corpus is Inanna's descent to the underworld. The goddess of love and war travels to the realm of her sister, Ereshkigal, passing through 7 gates, removing one garment and symbol of power at each threshold, until she arrives naked and powerless before the throne of death. There she is judged, killed, and hung on a hook like a piece of meat for 3 days and 3 nights before being rescued and resurrected. This myth has been interpreted as an allegory for the planet Venus disappearing from the evening sky and reappearing as the morning star, a cycle the Sumerians tracked with precision. But embedded in the myth is something else, the idea that even the gods can die, that there is a power greater than the Anunnaki themselves, that something rules the underworld, the place of darkness and judgment, and even the greatest gods must submit to its authority when they enter that realm. The myth begins with Inanna deciding to descend to the underworld to attend the funeral rites of the Bull of Heaven, her sister Ereshkigal's husband. She dresses in all her power and glory, wearing the crown of the steppe, the lapis beads around her neck, the twin egg beads upon her breast, the royal robe, the breastplate, the gold ring, and carrying the lapis measuring rod and line. Each item represents not just adornment but actual power, the symbols of her authority as queen of heaven and earth. At the first gate of the underworld, the gatekeeper Neti demands she remove her crown. At the second gate, her lapis beads. At each successive gate, another symbol of power is stripped away until she arrives at the throne room naked and powerless, reduced from mighty goddess to vulnerable being subject to judgment. This progressive stripping isn't just symbolic humiliation. The text makes clear that with each removed item, Inanna loses actual capability, actual authority, until she has nothing left to protect her. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, judges Inanna and finds her guilty. The 7 judges of the underworld, the Anunnaki in their role as arbiters of death, pronounce sentence, and Inanna dies. Not metaphorically, the text is explicit. She is killed, her corpse turned into rotting meat and hung on a hook in the underworld throne room. For 3 days and 3 nights she hangs there. Dead, beyond the reach of all her power and glory. Only through the intervention of Enki, who creates magical beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, beings that can enter the underworld without being subject to its laws because they're not truly alive, is Inanna rescued. They sprinkle her corpse with the food and water of life, and she resurrects, returning to the upper world. The laws of the underworld require a substitute. She must send someone to take her place. Eventually, she chooses her husband Dumuzi, who showed insufficient concern for her death, and he is dragged down to the underworld to serve as her replacement. The astronomical interpretation is compelling. Venus does disappear from the evening sky, remaining invisible for several days, before reappearing as the morning star. The Sumerians tracked this cycle precisely and associated it with Inanna, but the myth contains elements that go beyond celestial mechanics. The idea that gods can die, the existence of a realm where even divine beings lose their power and become subject to judgment, the presence of laws that even the greatest gods must obey, laws enforced by powers that seem to supersede the Anunnaki themselves. Ereshkigal is rarely mentioned in other contexts. She rules the underworld absolutely but almost never leaves it or involves herself in the affairs of the upper world. She's not part of the normal Anunnaki council. She's separate, ruling a domain that the other gods seem to fear and avoid, and the 7 judges who pronounce sentence on Inanna are described as Anunnaki, but function differently from the Anunnaki of the upper world, as if death transforms divine beings into something else, assigns them to different roles and different authorities. What this myth suggests is that the Anunnaki's power had limits. There were realms they didn't control, forces they couldn't overcome, laws they had to obey even when those laws conflicted with their desires. The underworld represented something beyond their authority, a power structure that superseded their own. And the fact that even Inanna, queen of heaven and earth, could be killed and had to be rescued suggests that the divine hierarchy was more complex and more dangerous than the simple pyramid of authority the king lists and temple genealogies implied. There were deeper mysteries, greater powers, territories where even gods walked carefully because they too could fall. The flood narrative appears across Mesopotamian literature in multiple versions, each adding details to a consistent core story. Humanity had grown too numerous, too loud, too troublesome. The gods decided to eliminate them. Enlil brought the waters. Only one man was warned by Enki, who defied the divine council's decision and whispered through the reed walls of a house, telling Ziusudra or Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim in later versions, to build a boat and save himself, his family, and representatives of all living creatures. The flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights. When it ended, the gods looked down at the destruction they had caused and wept with regret. They realized they had nearly destroyed the workforce they themselves depended on. This wasn't the righteous judgment of later religious traditions. This was capricious destruction followed by divine remorse. But some scholars have wondered if the flood myths encode not divine anger, but cosmic disaster. An impact event, rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, something that nearly wiped out early civilization and became embedded in cultural memory as divine punishment. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood accounts, describes the situation before the deluge with remarkable specificity. Cities had been built, kingship had been established, humanity had multiplied across the earth. But the noise of human civilization disturbed Enlil's rest. The clamor of human activity, the constant sound of building and farming and living, rose to the heavens and prevented the gods from sleeping. Enlil tried various methods to reduce the human population: plague, drought, famine, but each time Enki intervened to help humanity survive. Finally, Enlil convinced the divine council to authorize complete destruction through flood. The Atrahasis epic provides even more detail. The gods swore an oath together. binding themselves all to the plan so that none could be accused of breaking divine unanimity. They agreed to bring waters that would cover the earth and destroy all flesh. But Enki, bound by the oath not to directly warn humans, found a loophole. He spoke to the reed wall of Atrahasis's house, not to the man himself, telling the wall that a flood was coming and a boat must be built. Atrahasis, listening from inside, heard the warning and understood what he had to do. The boat's construction is described with engineering precision, specific dimensions, multiple decks, sealed with pitch inside and out, provisions loaded for a long journey, animals brought aboard in pairs or sevens depending on the species. When the rains came, the text describes them with visceral intensity. Water rose from below and fell from above. The foundations of the earth cracked open. The heavens themselves broke apart. The noise was terrifying. Even the gods, watching from their celestial realm, became frightened by the destruction they had unleashed. For 7 days and 7 nights, the waters covered everything. The boat tossed on currents that drowned mountains. Everything that lived on land perished. And when the waters finally began to recede, the gods looked down at what they had done and wept. Enlil had gotten his silence, but at the cost of everything the gods had built. The cities were gone, the temples destroyed, the offerings ceased because there was no one left to make them. The gods began to starve, the texts say, because they depended on human worship and sacrifice for sustenance. When Atrahasis emerged from the boat and offered sacrifice, the gods gathered around the offering like flies, desperate for the smoke and scent of worship. And then Enlil discovered that humans had survived, that Enki had circumvented the plan, and his fury shook the heavens. But the other gods intervened. They needed humanity. The destruction had been too complete. A compromise was reached. Humans would be allowed to continue, but their lifespans would be shortened, their reproductive capacity limited, and various other restrictions imposed to prevent them from becoming as numerous and troublesome as they had been before the flood. But was this really divine judgment, or were the myths describing a natural catastrophe so severe it nearly ended early civilization? Geological evidence supports the occurrence of massive flooding events in Mesopotamia. The Persian Gulf was once a river valley, flooded around 8,000 years ago when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. Regional floods from the Tigris and Euphrates could be catastrophic when multiple factors coincided: heavy rains, rapid snowmelt, storm surges from the Gulf. Archaeological excavations at Uruk, and other sites have found thick layers of water-deposited sediment separating earlier and later occupation levels, as if catastrophic floods really did occur and were remembered in cultural tradition. Some researchers have proposed even more dramatic scenarios: an asteroid impact in the Indian Ocean or Persian Gulf, a massive storm surge triggered by seismic activity, rapid glacial lake outbursts from ice age reservoirs. Any of these could have produced flooding on a scale that would have seemed like the end of the world to people living in the floodplains of Mesopotamia. And such an event, preserved in oral tradition for generations before being written down, might well have been interpreted through the religious framework available to ancient peoples as divine punishment, as the gods bringing destruction for humanity's failures. What the flood myths preserve, regardless of their exact origin, is the memory of catastrophe, of nearly complete destruction, of survival by the narrowest margin, of a world that ended and had to be rebuilt almost from nothing. And central to all versions is the idea that this wasn't random disaster but deliberate action by the Anunnaki, and that only Enki's intervention, his willingness to defy divine consensus to preserve humanity, allowed civilization to continue at all. We exist, according to these ancient texts, because one God chose to save us when all the others had voted for our extinction. The king lists make it clear that something fundamental changed after the flood. Before the deluge, Kings reigned for thousands or tens of thousands of years. After it, lifespans dropped dramatically, approaching more human normal durations within a few generations. The direct presence of the Anunnaki diminished. Hybrid god-kings gave way to fully human monarchs who merely claimed divine sponsorship rather than divine parentage. It was as if the flood served as a boundary, a before and after moment in human history. Before, gods walking the earth, hybrid rulers, impossibly long lives. After, human civilization continuing but without direct divine intervention, maintaining rituals and knowledge systems but increasingly distant from their source. Something had been severed. The connection between heaven and earth had been cut, leaving humanity to continue alone with only memories and tablets to remind them that once things had been different. The Sumerian king list divides history explicitly into two periods, before the flood and after the flood. The division is absolute and undisputed across all versions of the text. Before the flood, kings with names like Alulim and Al-Aljar ruled for 28,800 years and 36,000 years respectively. These aren't symbolic numbers meant to convey a long time. They're recorded with the same bureaucratic precision used for grain tallies and temple revenues, as if the scribes believed they were documenting actual chronology. Then comes the flood. And, when kingship descends from heaven again afterward, everything is different. The first post-flood king, Jushur of Kish, reigns for 1,200 years, still impossibly long by modern standards, but a dramatic reduction from the pre-flood numbers. His successors' reigns grow progressively shorter. 900 years. 600 years. Within a few generations, the numbers approach what we might consider plausible for exceptionally long-lived but still human rulers. By the time we reach historical kings whose reigns can be verified through contemporary records, the numbers match normal human lifespans. This pattern isn't random variation. It's a systematic diminishment, as if some factor that had allowed extreme longevity was removed or depleted after the flood. The texts themselves attribute this to divine decision, to the gods limiting human lifespan as part of the compromise that allowed humanity to survive at all. But what mechanism could produce such a pattern? If the pre-flood kings really were hybrid beings with significant Anunnaki genetic contribution, and if interbreeding with purely human populations gradually diluted that contribution, we might expect exactly this kind of progressive shortening of lifespan across generations. The nature of kingship changed as well. Pre-flood rulers are described as being appointed directly by the gods, as possessing divine characteristics, as being fundamentally different from the people they governed. Post-flood rulers increasingly depend on human political support, on military strength, on economic management. They still claim divine favor and maintain elaborate temple cults. But they no longer claim to be gods themselves, or even part god. They're intermediaries between human and divine realms, rather than inhabitants of both. The architectural record supports this transformation. Pre-flood cities, or at least the earliest layers of cities that claimed pre-flood origins, show construction techniques and urban planning that appear fully formed, sophisticated from the beginning. Post-flood expansion and rebuilding shows more gradual development, more trial and error, more regional variation, as different cities develop different solutions to similar problems. It's as if the direct knowledge transfer from Anunnaki teachers had ceased, and humans were now figuring things out on their own, building on foundations they had been given but without ongoing instruction. Temple rituals changed too. Early texts describe gods appearing physically to receive offerings, speaking directly to priests, providing oracles in clear language. Later texts describe increasingly elaborate divination practices, reading sheep livers, interpreting dreams, analyzing the flight of birds, as if priests were trying harder and harder to discern divine will that was no longer communicated directly. The gods were still believed to exist, still believed to influence events, But the channel of communication had narrowed to the point where every message had to be decoded from ambiguous signs rather than received as clear instruction. What the flood represented, in this reading, was not just a geological catastrophe, but a cosmic rupture. The age of direct divine-human interaction ended. The Anunnaki withdrew to the heavens, maintaining only distant observation of the civilization they had helped establish. Humanity continued, carrying forward the knowledge and systems they had been taught, but increasingly on their own, developing their own variations, making their own mistakes, slowly diverging from whatever pattern the Anunnaki had originally intended. And the memory of what had been lost was preserved in the king lists, in the flood myths, in the genealogies that traced certain families back to divine ancestors, in the astronomical observations that watched the skies as if waiting for return. The Sumerians never forgot that once things had been different, that once the gods walked among them, that once knowledge came from the Abzu and kingship descended from heaven, and the world made sense because those who built it were still present to maintain it. But after the flood, all that remained was memory, ritual, and the vast responsibility of maintaining a civilization whose builders had departed, leaving no clear instructions for what humanity should do next. The story of Babel appears in Genesis, but has deep roots in Mesopotamian tradition. A tower, a ziggurat, built with the explicit purpose of reaching heaven, an attempt by humanity to ascend to the divine realm, to bridge the gap that had opened after the flood. And the response was swift and severe. The languages of humanity were confused, the people scattered, the tower left unfinished. Traditional interpretations frame this as divine punishment for human arrogance. But what if it's describing something else? What if humanity, having lost contact with the Anunnaki, was attempting to rebuild that connection technologically? They were launch pads, landing platforms, architectural statements pointing toward the sky. Etemenanki, the ziggurat of Babylon, was called the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, and its design incorporated precise astronomical alignments. What if the confusion of languages wasn't punishment but defense? What if something didn't want humanity reaching too high, asking too many questions, or rebuilding the connection that had been severed? The biblical account in Genesis chapter 11 is remarkably brief. Humanity spoke one language. They settled in the land of Shinar, the biblical name for Mesopotamia, and said to one another, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves." The construction began with baked bricks and bitumen, the standard building materials of Mesopotamia. And then God, or the gods in some translations, came down to see what humanity was building and said, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." And the place was called Babel because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. Traditional theology interprets this as punishment for hubris, for human arrogance in attempting to reach heaven through their own efforts. But the text itself is ambiguous about what exactly was wrong with the tower. The divine beings express concern not about blasphemy or pride, but about capability. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. This sounds less like moral judgment and more like threat assessment. Humanity, united in purpose and language, working together with their technology and knowledge, had become capable of something the divine realm found concerning enough to intervene and prevent. Archaeological and textual evidence reveals that ziggurats were central to Mesopotamian religious architecture from the earliest periods. These weren't just symbolic structures. They were massive engineering projects, some rising over 90 meters into the sky, built with precise astronomical alignments, incorporating internal chambers and external staircases, designed with mathematical sophistication that required advanced knowledge of engineering and geometry. The ziggurat at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, showed construction techniques that created stable platforms capable of supporting enormous weight while resisting erosion and earthquake damage for thousands of years. Etemenanki, the great ziggurat of Babylon, was almost certainly the historical basis for the Tower of Babel narrative. Ancient sources describe it as a 7-stage tower with a temple on its summit, oriented to the cardinal directions, incorporating ritual chambers at various levels, connected to an elaborate temple complex at its base. The name Etemenanki means Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, suggesting it was understood as a connection point between realms, a place where the boundary between divine and human worlds could be crossed. Cuneiform tablets describe the function of ziggurats in ways that go beyond simple worship. They were called the bond between heaven and earth, places where gods could descend when visiting the human realm. The summit temples contained beds and dining facilities, as if expecting divine visitors who would need rest and sustenance. Rituals performed on ziggurats often involved priests ascending to the top to perform ceremonies meant to attract divine attention, to signal readiness for contact, to maintain the connection between earth and sky. What if the Babel story preserves memory of humanity's attempt to rebuild communication with the departed Anunnaki? After the flood, after the withdrawal of direct divine presence, humans might have attempted to recreate the conditions under which contact had previously occurred, building higher and higher structures, incorporating astronomical alignments to signal their position and readiness, using all the knowledge they had been taught to construct a gateway that might allow the return of those who had left. And what if the confusion of languages wasn't divine punishment, but a defensive measure by whatever power had replaced or superseded the Anunnaki? By fragmenting human language and scattering populations, the ability to coordinate large-scale projects requiring sophisticated knowledge transfer was disrupted. Humanity could maintain local civilizations, could continue using the technologies they had been taught, but could no longer unite in the kind of coordinated effort that might actually succeed in re-establishing contact with powers that had chosen to withdraw. The fact that this story appears in Hebrew tradition, which developed much later and in a different cultural context than Sumerian civilization, suggests it preserved memory of something significant enough to be passed down across cultures and centuries. The tower that reached too high, the unified humanity that became too capable, the intervention that scattered them and ensured they could never again coordinate on that scale, and the unfinished monument standing as a reminder that some boundaries are enforced, some connections are meant to stay severed, and some knowledge is not meant to be reclaimed. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers, the 200 angels who descended to Mount Hermon, teaching humanity knowledge that was explicitly forbidden. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor, and women to beautify themselves with cosmetics and jewelry. Semyaza taught enchantments and root-cutting. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakel taught astrology. Kokabiel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. This wasn't benevolent gift-giving. This was a violation of divine law, the sharing of knowledge that humanity wasn't meant to possess. The text makes it clear that these teachings corrupted humanity, leading to violence, vanity, and attempts to manipulate natural and supernatural forces beyond human understanding. The Watchers were bound in the valleys of the earth until the day of judgment, and the flood was sent to cleanse the world of the corruption their teachings had caused. But here's the unsettling question. Who decided this knowledge was forbidden? Who established the boundaries of what humanity was allowed to know? And what happened to that authority structure when the Anunnaki themselves disappeared? The Book of Enoch, preserved in its complete form only in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, though fragments exist in Greek, Aramaic, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, provides details about the Watchers that don't appear in the canonical biblical texts. 200 angels, organized in a hierarchical structure with named leaders, descended to Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, during the generations between Adam and Noah. They swore an oath together, binding themselves mutually to their plan, so that no individual could be held solely responsible for the transgression they were about to commit. Their initial motivation was desire for human women, but what followed was a systematic program of knowledge transfer that transformed human civilization. The text is explicit that this knowledge was forbidden, that it violated divine law, that it gave humans capabilities they were not meant to have: metalworking and weapon manufacture, cosmetics and personal adornment, enchantments and pharmacology, astrology and celestial observation, cloud reading and weather prediction, root cutting and agricultural manipulation, writing and notation. These weren't random teachings. They represented a complete technological package, everything needed to establish advanced civilization: military technology, manufacturing, cosmology, agriculture, recording systems. The parallels to the mez that Enki brought up from the Abzu are impossible to ignore. In both traditions, divine beings transfer knowledge to humanity against the wishes or without the permission of higher authorities. In both traditions, this knowledge transforms human society, and in both traditions, there are consequences. The Book of Enoch describes the results of these teachings in dark terms. Men became skilled in warfare, manufacturing weapons that made their conflicts more deadly. Women became vain, obsessed with appearance rather than substance. Humanity learned to manipulate forces they couldn't fully control, attempting magic and enchantments that produced unpredictable results. The hybrid children of the Watchers and human women grew into giants who consumed everything and spread violence across the earth. The punishment was severe and multi-layered. The archangels Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel were sent to address the crisis. Raphael bound Azazel in the wilderness, covering him with rough stones in a place of darkness, where he would remain until the day of judgment. Gabriel destroyed the hybrid giants, setting them against each other so they killed themselves in mutual warfare. Michael bound the other Watchers in the valleys of the earth, imprisoning them for 70 generations, and the flood was sent to cleanse the world of the corruption their teachings had produced. But the knowledge itself couldn't be completely erased. Noah, the righteous survivor, possessed some of it. The traditions preserved in his family and passed down to his descendants included astronomy, agriculture, metalworking, all the arts the Watchers had taught. The flood destroyed the corruption but not the capabilities. Humanity emerged from the deluge diminished but still possessing knowledge they had been given. Knowledge that would allow civilization to rebuild. This raises profound questions about authority and control. Who decided which knowledge was permissible and which was forbidden? The text presents this as divine law, but who established that law and why? If the Watchers were angels, messengers, and servants of God, why did they have access to forbidden knowledge in the first place? Were they rebelling against unjust restrictions or violating necessary boundaries? And if there was an authority structure that could punish the Watchers, bind them for generations, send floods to cleanse corruption, where was that authority when the Anunnaki were teaching humanity and creating hybrid offspring and walking the earth as kings? The parallels between the Watchers' narrative and the Anunnaki traditions suggest they might be describing the same events from different theological perspectives. Divine beings descended. They taught humanity advanced knowledge. They took human wives and produced hybrid offspring. Their actions led to corruption and violence. A flood was sent that nearly destroyed humanity. The divine beings were removed from direct contact with humanity. The connections are too specific to be coincidental. But there's a crucial difference. The Book of Enoch presents the Watchers' teachings as transgression against a higher authority that subsequently intervened to stop them. The Sumerian texts present the Anunnaki's teachings as their prerogative as creators and rulers of humanity. One narrative describes rebellion punished, the other describes authority exercised. Which framing is correct? Or are both attempts to explain the same sequence of events, divine knowledge transfer followed by catastrophe followed by divine departure, through different cultural and theological lenses? And if there was indeed a higher authority that judged and punished the Watchers for teaching humanity forbidden knowledge, what happened to that authority? Why did it intervene once and then apparently withdraw, leaving humanity to develop on its own? The tablets and texts describe the Anunnaki departing, but they don't describe what replaced them or what continued to govern the cosmic order they left behind. The silence is unsettling, as if something intervened once, severely, and then stepped back to observe what humanity would do with the knowledge we had been given and the memory of what had been taken away. In Babylonian mythology, which evolved from Sumerian tradition after the rise of Babylon as a political power, a new god ascends to supremacy. Marduk, patron deity of Babylon, defeats the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat in cosmic battle, and from her body creates the world. He takes the tablet of destinies from her and becomes supreme ruler of heaven and earth. The older Anunnaki, including Anu and Enlil, bow before him and acknowledge his authority. This wasn't a gradual theological evolution. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes a violent cosmic revolution, a changing of the guard, a new power structure imposed through force. And here's what's interesting. The Enuma Elish was written around 1200 BCE, much later than the Sumerian texts. It describes events set in mythological deep time, but it was composed during a period of massive political and cultural change in Mesopotamia. Was it pure political propaganda, elevating Babylon's god to supremacy to match the city's political dominance? Or was it recording, in mythological language, an actual shift in whatever cosmic hierarchy the Anunnaki represented? The Enuma Elish, recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh and first translated by George Smith in 1876, tells a story dramatically different from the Sumerian creation narratives. Where the older texts describe the Anunnaki as a stable hierarchy with Anu at the top and various gods serving specialized functions, the Enuma Elish describes cosmic revolution and violent succession. In the beginning, according to this text, there was Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water, and from their mingling the first gods were born. But these gods were noisy and disturbing, preventing Apsu from resting. He decided to destroy them, but Ea, the Babylonian version of Enki, discovered the plot and killed Apsu first, establishing his dwelling in the depths where Apsu had ruled. From this dwelling, Ea's son Marduk was born, already possessing 4 eyes and 4 ears, already capable of awesome power. Tiamat, enraged at her consort's death, created an army of monsters to destroy the younger gods. She appointed Kingu as her champion and gave him the Tablet of Destinies, conferring supreme authority. The younger gods panicked, unable to stand against Tiamat's power. But Marduk offered to fight her on one condition. If he won, he would become supreme ruler, and all the gods would bow to his authority. Desperate, they agreed. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is described with vivid detail. Marduk caught her in a net, drove evil wind into her mouth when she opened it to devour him, shot an arrow through her distended belly that split her heart. He cut her body in half, using one part to form the sky and the other to form the earth. From her eyes flowed the Tigris and Euphrates. From Kingu's blood, mixed with earth, he created humanity to serve the gods. And he took the Tablet of Destinies, claiming supreme authority over heaven and earth. The older gods Anu, Enlil, Ea, and the rest acknowledged Marduk's supremacy and gave him 50 names, each representing a different aspect of divine power. They built Babylon as his city and Esagila as his temple. The cosmic order was restructured with Marduk at its head, and the older hierarchy was subsumed into the new one. Scholars have long debated whether the Enuma Elish represents genuine theological development or political propaganda. Babylon rose to dominance in Mesopotamia during the Old Babylonian period, 1800 to 1600 BCE, and reached its peak power under Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century BCE. The elevation of Babylon's patron god to supreme cosmic authority conveniently paralleled the city's political ascension, writing a creation epic that placed Marduk at the center of everything legitimized Babylonian rule as reflecting divine cosmic order. But there are elements in the text that don't fit neatly into a propaganda framework. The older gods aren't eliminated or humiliated. They acknowledge Marduk's supremacy, but retain their functions and receive honor. The cosmic battle isn't presented as good versus evil, but as order versus chaos, with Marduk establishing structure and system where previously there was conflict and disorder. And the text was composed and preserved by priests, who maintained continuity with older Sumerian traditions, who preserved and copied the ancient texts even while elevating their own city's god. What if the Enuma Elish is describing, in mythological language, an actual shift in cosmic hierarchy? Not a human political transition, but a change in whatever power structure the Anunnaki represented. The older gods bow to a new supreme authority. The Tablet of Destinies changes hands through violent conflict. A new order is established that subsumes but doesn't eliminate the old one. If the myths encode real events, this suggests that between the time of the oldest Sumerian texts and the composition of the Enuma Elish, something fundamental changed in the divine realm. A succession occurred. Power was transferred, and the older Anunnaki, who had walked the earth and taught humanity and created hybrid offspring, either accepted subordination to a new authority or were displaced by it. The timing is suggestive. The Enuma Elish was composed after the Anunnaki had already withdrawn from direct contact with humanity. It describes events in deep mythological time, but was written during a period when divine presence was already distant, when temples operated through ritual and prayer rather than direct divine appearance. Was it recording the reason for that withdrawal? Was Marduk's ascension connected to the departure of the older gods? Did something happen in the divine hierarchy that ended the age of direct intervention and began the age of distant worship? The parallels between Mesopotamian and Greek mythology have long fascinated scholars. In Greek tradition, an older generation of gods, the Titans, ruled the cosmos until they were overthrown by younger gods, the Olympians, in a cosmic war called the Titanomachy. Zeus and his siblings defeated Kronos and the elder gods, binding them in Tartarus, a prison beneath even the underworld. The similarities to Marduk's rise and the diminishment of the older Anunnaki are striking. Both narratives describe generational conflict among divine beings. Both involve the overthrow of an elder order and the establishment of a new one. Both result in the older gods being bound or banished while the younger ones take control. And both occur in mythological deep time, before recorded history but after the creation of humanity. If these are cultural memories of actual events rather than pure invention, they suggest that whatever happened to the Anunnaki wasn't unique to Mesopotamia. It was part of a larger pattern, a cosmic shift that echoed across multiple ancient civilizations. The Titanomachy, preserved in Hesiod's Theogony from the 8th century BCE, describes a war that lasted 10 years between the older Titan gods led by Kronos and the younger Olympian gods led by Zeus. The Titans had ruled since the beginning of time, having themselves overthrown the even more primordial Ouranos. But Kronos, fearing prophecy that he would be overthrown by his children, swallowed each one as they were born. Only Zeus escaped, hidden by his mother Rhea, and when he reached maturity, he freed his siblings and led them in rebellion against the Titans. The war was cosmic in scale. Mountains shattered, the earth burned, the seas boiled. Weapons of impossible power were wielded by both sides. Zeus wielded lightning bolts forged by the Cyclopes. The Titans fought with the raw forces of nature they had controlled since creation. But the younger gods, though fewer in number, fought with superior strategy and newfound weapons, and eventually they prevailed. The defeated Titans were bound in Tartarus, a prison so deep beneath the underworld that an anvil would fall for 9 days before reaching it. Kronos and the other Titans were imprisoned there, guarded by monsters, unable to escape or influence the world above. The Olympians established their rule on Mount Olympus, restructuring the cosmic order with Zeus as supreme authority, distributing domains among the victorious younger gods, and beginning a new era in divine governance. The structural parallels to both the Enuma Elish and the older Anunnaki narratives are remarkable. An elder generation of gods rules the cosmos. A younger generation rises to challenge them. Cosmic war erupts, devastating the earth. The younger gods win through superior weapons or strategy. The elder gods are defeated but not destroyed, instead being bound or imprisoned. A new cosmic order is established with the victorious younger generation in control. These parallels appear across cultures separated by vast distances and significant time periods. Mesopotamian, Hebrew, and Greek traditions all preserve versions of divine succession through conflict. Hindu mythology describes similar patterns with the Devas and Asuras. Norse mythology has the war between the Aesir and Vanir. Egyptian mythology contains echoes in the conflicts between Osiris, Set, and Horus. The consistency suggests either widespread cultural diffusion of mythological motifs or more unsettling independent preservation of common memories, different cultures recording the same sequence of events through their own religious frameworks. If these myths encode actual cosmic events rather than pure imagination, they suggest that whatever happened to the Anunnaki was part of a larger pattern affecting the entire divine hierarchy across the ancient world. A succession, a revolution, a changing of the guard that occurred in mythological deep time, but was remembered clearly enough to be embedded in the foundational myths of multiple civilizations. And there's a common thread across all these traditions. After the cosmic war, after the succession, direct divine presence in human affairs diminished. The younger gods who won didn't walk the earth as their predecessors had. They ruled from distant heavens, intervening occasionally but no longer living among humans, no longer teaching directly, no longer creating hybrid offspring or establishing dynasties. As if the war itself, or the victory of the younger gods, established a new protocol that required distance between divine and human realms. As if one of the casualties of the cosmic revolution was the intimate connection that had previously existed between gods and humans, a connection that the older deities like the Anunnaki had maintained, but which the new order chose or was required to sever. So we return to the question that opened this journey. What if the Anunnaki didn't leave by choice? What if something more powerful arrived? The myths, when read as potentially encoded history rather than pure fantasy, contain consistent patterns. An older order of gods who descended from the heavens, who created or modified humanity, who walked the earth as kings and teachers, a period of divine human interaction that ended abruptly, wars among the gods themselves, a flood that nearly destroyed humanity, a gradual withdrawal of direct divine presence, and in later myths from various cultures, the emergence of a new divine order that claimed supremacy over the old. If we take these patterns seriously, not as literal fact, but as potential memory filtered through the only interpretive framework available to ancient peoples, they suggest a sequence: arrival, intervention, conflict, departure. But departure under what circumstances? Were the Anunnaki recalled by some higher authority? Did they lose a war to a more powerful faction? Did something happen that made Earth inhospitable or irrelevant to them? The tablets don't give clear answers, but the silence itself might be the most important clue. Civilizations don't forget their gods casually. The fact that the Anunnaki were remembered with such detail, that their names and hierarchies and conflicts were recorded so carefully, suggests that their departure was traumatic, significant, and sudden enough to mark a clear before and after in human consciousness. something happened, and humanity has been looking at the sky, watching, waiting, and wondering ever since. The evidence, when assembled from tablets and king lists and temple inscriptions across millennia, forms a pattern. The Anunnaki arrived or emerged in the deep past, bringing kingship and knowledge and transforming scattered human settlements into urban civilization. They walked among humans, created hybrid offspring who ruled as kings with superhuman capabilities and impossibly long lifespans. They established hierarchies, built temples, organized society according to principles they brought from wherever they came from, the sky, the Abzu, the cosmic realm beyond human understanding. But their presence was not peaceful. The tablets describe conflicts among them, Enlil versus Enki over humanity's fate, struggles over the tablet of destinies that determined who held supreme authority, wars using weapons that shattered mountains and made stones speak, Inanna's descent revealing that even gods could die, that there were powers greater than the Anunnaki themselves. These weren't stable, benevolent rulers guiding humanity gently toward enlightenment. These were powerful beings engaged in their own struggles, their own political conflicts, their own succession crises, and humanity was caught in the middle. Created to serve, taught enough to be useful but with boundaries placed on what knowledge we could access. The Watchers who crossed those boundaries, who taught forbidden arts, were punished severely. The Tower of Babel that attempted to rebuild connection with departed gods was scattered and confused. Humanity was allowed to maintain what we had been given but prevented from reaching beyond it, from reconnecting with sources of knowledge that had withdrawn. The flood marks a clear boundary in every tradition that preserves it. Before, gods walking the earth, hybrid rulers with impossible lifespans, direct divine intervention. After, gradual diminishment, increasing distance, human monarchs claiming divine favor but no longer possessing divine blood. Something fundamental changed. The age of direct contact ended, and the explanations, preserved in myths across multiple cultures, all involve conflict, catastrophe, and cosmic succession. Marduk rises to supremacy in Babylon, and the older Anunnaki bow before him. The Olympians defeat the Titans and bind them in Tartarus. Across cultures separated by geography and time, the pattern repeats. Younger gods overthrow elder ones, and after the succession, the elder gods withdraw or are withdrawn, no longer walking the earth, no longer directly accessible to human worship. What if the Anunnaki didn't choose to leave? What if they lost? What if the cosmic succession described in the Enuma Elish and echoed in Greek mythology actually occurred, and the beings who had walked the earth as teachers and kings were defeated, bound, or banished by whatever power structure replaced them? The younger gods who took control established different protocols, different relationships with humanity, distance instead of intimacy, prayer instead of direct communication, divination instead of clear instruction. Or perhaps the Anunnaki were recalled by an authority even higher than themselves, judged for their intervention in human affairs, for creating hybrid offspring, for teaching knowledge that humanity wasn't supposed to possess. The Watchers were bound in the valleys of the earth. Perhaps the Anunnaki faced similar judgment, removed from their positions, prevented from continuing their direct involvement with the civilization they had helped establish. Or perhaps something happened that made Earth no longer relevant or accessible to them. A cosmic shift that closed whatever pathways they had used to travel between their realm and ours. A change in conditions that made their presence here unsustainable or dangerous. The astronomical obsession that followed their departure suggests the Sumerians were watching for return, tracking planetary movements with desperate precision, as if hoping to detect the signs that would indicate the pathways were opening again. The tablets don't provide definitive answers. They provide fragments, patterns, memories, preserved through religious frameworks that attempted to make sense of events beyond their author's full comprehension. But the silence itself is telling. The careful preservation of names and hierarchies and genealogies, the continued worship at temples built for gods who no longer appeared, the astronomical observations maintained for generations, watching skies that remained empty of everything except stars and planets following their ordained paths. Civilizations don't forget their gods without reason. The fact that memory of the Anunnaki persisted for thousands of years, that their stories were copied and recopied, that their temples were maintained and rebuilt, suggests that their presence mattered enormously, and their departure left a void that subsequent generations tried desperately to fill through ritual and observation and hope. What happened? The evidence suggests arrival, intervention, conflict, and departure. But the circumstances of that departure remain shrouded in the mythological language of cosmic war, divine judgment, and catastrophic flood. Something ended the age of divine human interaction. Something removed or withdrew the Anunnaki from direct contact with the civilization they had helped create, and humanity was left to continue alone, maintaining the knowledge we had been given, preserving the memory of those who had taught us, watching the skies in case they might return, and wondering what we did or what happened that caused the gods to fall silent and the heavens to close. And so, as you drift towards sleep tonight, somewhere between dream and history, consider the ancient scribes pressing warnings and memories into wet clay by lamplight, knowing they would never see the future they were trying to preserve. They recorded what they witnessed or what had been passed down to them through generations of careful remembering, names of gods who walked the earth, hierarchies of beings who descended from the sky, conflicts that shattered mountains and changed the course of human civilization, and then the silence, the withdrawal, the long age of watching and waiting that continues still. The tablets rest in museum cases now, behind protective glass, their cuneiform marks still holding questions we're only beginning to ask in ways that might lead to answers. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to wait, patient as stone, until the moment we're ready to understand what our ancestors were truly saying. Not mythology, not primitive superstition, but memory, encoded in the only language available to people trying to preserve something too important to forget. You're connected to them across all the millennia that separate your world from theirs. The same questions that kept Sumerian astronomers watching the night sky with desperate precision still pull at human consciousness today. Where did we come from? Who taught us? Why did they leave? Will they return? The tablets don't answer these questions conclusively, but they preserve them, keep them alive, ensure that the wondering continues across generations. So let yourself drift now into the same darkness those ancient watchers knew, under the same stars they tracked with such intensity, part of the same human story of memory and mystery and hope. The Anunnaki may be silent, the heavens may seem empty, but the questions remain. And perhaps, in the space between sleeping and waking, in the dreams that come when consciousness releases its grip, some echo of that ancient knowledge still resonates, still calls, still connects us to a past that was stranger and more profound than we've allowed ourselves to believe. Rest now.